All right, so today we're diving deep into something I know a lot of you have been wanting to understand better.
Okay.
Trauma.
Hmm.
We've got some really insightful excerpts from a document
Oh,
that we're
cool.
going to be looking at, and I think you'll find this one pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Um, so we're going to unpack exactly what trauma is,
Yeah.
how it can actually impact mental health
Okay.
in ways that go well beyond just PTSD.
Right.
And we'll talk about what all this means, for individuals and society as a whole.
Yeah.
But what might actually surprise you is that trauma is probably a lot more common than you think,
Mm-hmm.
and it can actually show up in some pretty unexpected ways.
That's so true. Yeah, a lot of people think about trauma and they just think of like a single big event, you know,
Right.
like the kind of stuff you see in movies, but it's actually way more nuanced than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the document we're looking at actually starts by defining trauma as,
Oh.
the emotional, psychological, and even physical response to an overwhelming event, or sometimes even like a whole series of events.
Right.
And it really emphasizes that it's not just the event itself,
Yeah.
but it's really about how that event breaks down your sense of safety
Right.
and well-being.
Yeah.
And it's about the lasting mark that leaves on you.
Totally.
And it's, it can be a lot to deal with.
It is.
Yeah.
And what's really important to keep in mind, I think, is that trauma
Yeah.
is subjective, right? So like what might be totally traumatic for one person might not even really faze someone else. It all comes down to like their personal history, their coping mechanisms that they've developed over time,
Yeah.
and then also just like how they perceive the event itself.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
One thing I found interesting in this document was that you
Yeah.
actually mentioned how the word trauma is kind of overused these days.
Right.
And that can kind of dilute the meaning of the word a little bit. And to help us understand this better, they actually broke trauma down into 4 different categories.
Okay.
So we have event-based trauma,
Okay.
developmental trauma,
Mm-hmm.
complex trauma,
Okay.
and then continuous or low-level trauma.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Those are really helpful categories for understanding all the different ways that trauma can like show up in somebody's life.
Right.
So like that first one you mentioned, event-based trauma, I think that's what we typically think of, right?
Right.
So like a car accident or a natural disaster
Yeah.
or a violent assault, those really sudden, intense experiences.
Like a one-off. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then you have like developmental trauma,
Right.
and that happens during childhood.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're talking about neglect or abuse
Yeah.
or even just like chronic instability at home.
Right.
And these kinds of experiences can actually impact brain development.
Wow.
And that can lead to like some serious long-term consequences.
Yeah, that's heavy stuff.
It is.
And then you have complex trauma,
Yeah.
which is like repeated and prolonged exposure to these traumatic events.
Mm-hmm.
Often it's interpersonal,
Okay.
like chronic abuse or exposure to community violence.
Right. And then that last category, continuous or low-level trauma,
Mhm.
that refers to, that's more like the ongoing stress of things like poverty,
Right.
discrimination, or other types of chronic adverse conditions.
Like just kind of always there.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a constant low-grade stressor.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to remember, too, that these categories aren't like mutually exclusive.
Right.
They can overlap. They can even build on each other.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and the document actually gave a really a good example of that.
Yeah.
It talked about a child who's growing up in poverty and they're
Mhm.
experiencing domestic violence at home,
Mm.
and this can lead to problems with attachment with their caregivers,
Oh, wow.
and then that can eventually contribute to complex trauma later in life.
So it's like a chain reaction almost.
It can be.
Yeah. Wow. So we're really seeing how, this complex web of experiences can have these really significant impacts that can ripple out through a person's life. It's not just about
Right.
getting over one bad thing.
Exactly.
Oh.
And it's interesting, we tend to associate trauma with PTSD, but
Right.
the document actually argues that trauma plays a fundamental role
Yeah.
in a lot of different mental health conditions.
It's not just PTSD.
It's not just PTSD. No, there's a lot more to it.
Oh.
And that actually brings us to something that's called trauma theory,
Okay.
which can help us understand how trauma disrupts our sense of safety.
Mm-hmm.
It impacts our coping mechanisms, and then it can ultimately lead to a whole range of mental health challenges.
Oh, wow. Okay. So break that down a little bit for us.
Okay, so think about those those post-traumatic stress responses,
Yeah.
like flashback nightmares and hypervigilance.
Okay.
So trauma theory kind of digs into how those develop. Like it looks at, why somebody might be experiencing those.
Okay.
And when we start talking about complex trauma, we see even like deeper issues. So people can have trouble regulating their emotions.
Right.
They might struggle with their self-concept
Yeah.
and have real difficulty in relationships.
It's like almost like it throws a wrench in your whole mental machinery.
Yeah, it's like this disruption that
Yeah.
makes it so much harder to function in a healthy way.
Right.
And what's interesting here is that it doesn't always fit neatly into those diagnostic boxes that we like to use in the mental health field. And to label everything.
Right, in a neat little box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why this document really stresses the need for for what we call a trauma-informed approach to mental health care.
Okay.
And it's an approach that really tries to look at the individual's unique history and their experiences.
Okay, so really taking that into account when we're talking about treatment.
Exactly, yeah. It's about moving away from just labeling symptoms.
Right.
And really trying to get to those root causes, which so often lead back to some form of trauma.
Okay, so now there's this concept mentioned in the document called the window of tolerance.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah, and I thought it was a really helpful way to visualize how trauma can impact us.
It is. It's a great visual. So imagine you have this like metaphorical window, right?
Yeah.
Where you can function well, you can cope with all of life's ups and downs. Well, trauma can shrink that window.
Oh, wow.
Making it much harder to regulate your emotions.
So what happens when you step outside that window?
Well, you're going to end up in one of two states.
Okay.
Either hyperarousal, which is that fight or flight response,
Right.
or hypoarousal, which is that freeze response.
I see. So a lot of those mental health symptoms then, whether we're talking about anxiety or, depression, could actually be understood as either that hyper or hypoarousal.
Right. It's like the trauma's kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And the document actually lists a whole bunch of different mental health diagnoses where trauma can be a major contributing factor.
Like what?
So you've got obviously PTSD, but then also depression, anxiety disorders, substance use, addiction, dissociative disorders, and even personality disorders.
That's a huge range.
It is.
Yeah.
Now remember, this doesn't mean that everyone who experiences trauma is going to develop these issues.
Of course.
How somebody's affected by trauma really depends on a whole variety of factors.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, we're talking about the severity of the trauma itself.
Okay.
How long it lasted, the support systems that they have in place,
Right.
their personality, their coping skills, and even their previous trauma history.
Right, because people are resilient.
They are.
And it's easy to get kind of overwhelmed by all this information.
It is.
But it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah. And in fact, the document talks about this concept called post-traumatic growth.
Okay.
Where some people actually experience positive changes after trauma.
That's interesting.
Yeah. They might come out of it with a greater appreciation for life.
Okay.
Increased personal strength, or even a sense of new possibilities.
I mean, what does that growth look like?
Well, let's say somebody experiences a serious illness. They might come out of that with a totally new sense of gratitude for their health and a deeper connection to their loved ones.
Yeah.
Or someone who goes through a period of really intense grief might find that they're more compassionate and empathetic towards others.
So they're able to kind of channel that into something positive.
Yeah, they take that experience and use it to fuel their own growth.
That's pretty amazing.
It really is. It's a testament to how resilient people can be.
Yeah.
And how much we can transform even in the face of adversity.
So we've been talking about the impact on individuals. But what about on like a larger scale? What does all of this mean when we're thinking about, public mental health?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So public mental health is all about improving mental health for everyone, at a population level.
Okay.
And it focuses on prevention and making sure there are safeguards in place to reduce the impact of those mental health challenges.
Right.
And what we're learning about trauma is that it's deeply connected to these larger social issues like poverty, discrimination, and inequality.
That's like a vicious cycle.
It is, yeah.
Because those social issues create environments where trauma is more likely to happen.
Right.
And then the impact of that trauma can actually make those same issues worse.
It perpetuates the cycle, yeah.
Yeah.
And the document actually makes a really good point about
Okay.
how crucial those childhood experiences are.
Yeah.
Early adversity can literally shape how a person's brain develops
Oh.
and their whole outlook on the world.
So it seems like we need a much more proactive approach then
Mm-hmm.
to public mental health, one that starts, early and really addresses those social and economic factors
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
we know contribute to trauma.
It's about recognizing that mental health isn't just an individual thing.
Yeah.
It's a collective issue.
Right.
We need to work together to build communities that are supportive and resilient.
Okay. So how do we actually tackle this? What kind of strategies are we talking about?
Well, the document actually outlines kind of a refreshed approach to public mental health,
Okay.
specifically for Cumberland.
All right. Lay it on us.
All right, so it focuses on 4 key elements.
Let's hear them.
The first one is tackling those social and economic determinants of mental health that we've been talking about.
So that's like addressing poverty,
Mm-hmm.
providing economic opportunity.
Exactly, and making sure there are support systems in place.
Mhm.
It means getting rid of systemic discrimination and promoting inclusivity.
Right.
It also means addressing domestic violence through things like prevention programs and support for survivors.
Wow. That's a lot to take on.
It is.
Yeah. It sounds like it would require
Yeah.
collaboration across all kinds of sectors,
Yeah, for sure.
like government, healthcare, education, even law enforcement.
Absolutely. It takes a multifaceted approach.
Yeah.
Because it's a multifaceted challenge. And on top of that,
Yeah.
we also need a fundamental shift in our attitudes
Okay.
and beliefs about mental health.
So like that culture shift we were talking about.
Exactly. Yeah, we need to move away from the stigma and judgment
Right.
and move towards a more understanding and compassionate approach.
So creating a culture where people actually feel safe talking about their experiences and reaching out for help.
Exactly. And that brings us to the final section of this document, which looks at how this understanding of trauma should change
Yeah.
how we think about mental health services and interventions.
I'm curious about that. If we're going to make that shift to
Yeah.
a more trauma-informed approach,
Yeah.
what does that actually look like?
Well, it means moving away from just focusing on
Okay.
symptoms and diagnoses.
Mm-hmm.
We really have to consider the person's trauma history and understand how that might be affecting their struggles.
So it's about asking what happened to you
Exactly.
instead of what's wrong with you.
That's it. Yeah. And the document actually mentions something called the power threat meaning framework as a really good example of a trauma-informed approach.
Mm-hmm.
It really encourages us to move away from that
Right.
traditional what's wrong with you
Yeah.
mentality
Yeah.
and shift towards a more compassionate and insightful what happened to you approach.
Wow. Yeah, I can see how that shift in perspective could really change how we deliver
Yeah.
mental health services.
Absolutely. And the document actually outlines several
Okay.
key service implications of adopting this kind of approach.
What are some of those?
So, for example, we need to improve access to services that are specifically designed
Okay.
to help people cope with trauma
That makes sense.
for both children and adults.
Yeah, not every therapist or counselor is equipped
Right.
to deal with that.
Exactly. And it's not just about therapy either.
Oh.
It's about understanding that healing from trauma is a holistic process.
Yeah.
We need to provide support that addresses their physical, emotional, social,
Wow.
and even spiritual needs.
It's about the whole person.
It is, yeah. It's about looking at the whole picture.
Hmm.
And another key implication is that we need to really emphasize resilience and coping models.
Okay.
Instead of trying to cure mental illness,
Right.
we should focus on helping people develop the skills and strategies.
To manage their experiences
Well,
and build resilience.
It's about empowering them,
It is, yeah.
kind of take an active role
Exactly.
in their own healing.
We need to teach them practical coping skills.
Right.
Like the ones mentioned in the document, things like decider skills, which uses cognitive behavioral therapy techniques
Right.
to help people manage their thoughts and emotions.
So giving them those tools
Yeah.
to kind of navigate life's challenges.
Exactly. And this kind of training could be used in all sorts of settings.
Oh, wow.
Like schools, community centers, workplaces, healthcare facilities.
Yeah.
The more we equip people with these skills,
Right.
the more resilient our community becomes as a whole.
I'm also seeing a real focus on prevention here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a strong emphasis on catching things early
Yeah.
and addressing those social and economic factors that we know contribute to trauma,
Right.
especially for children. So it sounds like while there are definitely some challenges, there's also some real opportunity here
Yeah, I think so.
to create a more trauma-informed environment.
Yeah. And it requires us to be willing to tackle those big systemic issues, investing in specialized services,
Right.
and empowering individuals with those resilience building skills.
So it's really a whole system approach.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's a journey, not a destination.
Right. It takes effort.
It does.
And it takes collaboration.
Absolutely. Well said.
Yeah.
And so now, in the next part of our deep dive, we're actually going to zoom in on Cumberland specifically.
No, perfect.
And we'll look at some of the specific challenges
Yeah.
and opportunities for putting these trauma-informed approaches into action.
Looking forward to it.
All right.
All right. All right. So we've kind of laid the groundwork for understanding trauma and its impact. But now let's zoom in a little bit on Cumberland.
Okay.
This document that we're going through, actually, it outlines some pretty unique challenges and opportunities when it comes to putting these trauma-informed approaches into action.
Yeah, it's one thing to understand trauma in theory,
Right.
but when you start thinking about actually putting it into practice
Yeah.
within a specific community like Cumberland, that's where things get really interesting.
Totally. So what were some of the things that kind of jumped out at you as some of the biggest hurdles that Cumberland might face?
Well, one of the first things I noticed was that the document pointed out a pretty significant gap in services, specifically designed to help people cope with trauma.
Okay.
And this gap seems to exist for both children and adults.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we were just talking about the need for those specialized services in the last
That's
part.
not something that every therapist or counselor is trained to deal with.
Right, exactly.
So while it's great that there's this movement toward a trauma-informed approach, across the board in mental health services, there's also a need for those really specialized services that can handle those more complex aspects of trauma.
So basically, Cumberland needs to invest in those services.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
If they really want to meet the needs of their community.
Exactly.
Okay. And then on top of that, the document also highlighted the need for some pretty big societal changes to really address the root causes of trauma.
Right. Because as we talked about, things like poverty, discrimination, domestic violence, and substance misuse, all of those contribute to a higher likelihood of trauma in the first place.
It's like we're trying to treat the symptoms, but not actually addressing the underlying disease.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
The document really makes the point that if you want an effective public mental health strategy, it can't just be about individual interventions.
Yeah.
You have to tackle those systemic issues as well.
Okay, so that sounds like a pretty big undertaking.
It is.
Where do we even begin with something that complex?
Well, the document points to the importance of creating a more equitable and just society. And that means a lot of different things.
Yeah, like what?
Well, it means tackling poverty, making sure people have economic opportunities and support systems.
Yeah.
It means getting rid of that systemic discrimination and promoting inclusivity. And it means taking a strong stance against domestic violence.
Okay.
Having solid prevention programs and providing real support for survivors.
Right.
And then finally, addressing substance misuse with a combination of prevention, treatment, and harm reduction strategies.
I'm hearing a lot of collaboration here.
Yeah.
It's not just one person's responsibility or one sector's responsibility. It sounds like a real partnership between, the government, healthcare, education, even law enforcement.
Absolutely. And beyond those practical steps, it requires a fundamental shift in how we think about and talk about mental health.
So you're talking about that culture shift again.
Yeah, exactly. We need to move away from that stigma and judgment and create a culture where people in Cumberland actually feel safe talking about their experiences and reaching out for help without feeling ashamed or judged.
That's a really great point.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the challenges, but this document also highlights some opportunities, right?
It does, yeah. It's not all doom and gloom.
Okay, good.
One thing they pointed to was the existence of some really impressive lived experience recovery organizations, or LIAROs. And these are organizations that are actually run by people who have lived experience with mental health challenges, including trauma. They can provide peer support and advocacy that's just incredibly valuable.
I mean, I can see how that would be so powerful to have someone who truly gets it,
Yeah.
who's been there themselves.
It makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
And the document actually suggested that Cumberland should think about expanding its support for these LROs and integrating them even more into the mental health system because they have so much knowledge and insight to offer.
That's a great example of how lived experience can actually be a driving force for change.
It can.
Yeah.
And there are other opportunities, too.
Yeah.
The document mentioned the potential of those resilience training and education programs, like that Decider Skills program we were talking about. Just teaching people some practical coping skills and strategies for managing their emotions and responses to those tough situations can be really empowering.
So giving them the tools to kind of navigate those challenges.
Exactly. And this training could be used in so many different settings.
Like what?
Well, you could use it in schools, community centers, workplaces, even in healthcare facilities.
The more people we can equip with those skills, the better off the community is.
Exactly. The more resilient we all become.
Yeah. I'm also seeing a big focus on prevention here.
Oh, for sure. There's a strong emphasis on catching things early, addressing those social and economic factors, especially when it comes to kids trying to prevent those traumatic experiences from happening in the first place.
So it sounds like while there are definitely some challenges to address, there are also some real opportunities here.
Absolutely.
For Cumberland to create a more trauma-informed environment.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
It requires that commitment to tackling those systemic issues that we've been talking about, investing in those specialized trauma services, supporting those LROs, and giving individuals those resilience-building skills.
So it's really that whole system approach.
It is.
Recognizing how interconnected everything is.
Exactly.
Mental health, social justice, individual well-being.
It's all connected.
And it's a journey, not a destination.
It is, yeah. It's ongoing.
It takes constant effort.
It does.
And collaboration.
Well said.
All right, so now in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture. You know, what does this all mean for us, for our relationships, our communities, the human experience as a whole?
Those are the big questions.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
Me too.
All right, so welcome back to a final part of our deep dive into trauma. You know, I feel like we've covered so much ground already. From defining it to exploring its effects on mental health and even diving into the need for trauma-informed approaches in public health and mental health services.
Absolutely.
But now I'm really curious to explore the bigger picture, you know? What does all of this mean for us personally, for our relationships, our communities?
Right. That's a great question, and I think it really gets to the heart of why understanding trauma is so important. You know, when we start to understand how widespread it is, and how these ripple effects work, it can really change how we see the world around us, you know, how we interact with other people. And even how we understand our own experiences.
So it's not just about mental health in like a clinical sense.
No, not at all.
It's about broadening our understanding of the human experience.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think one of the most important takeaways for me from all this is that, you know, trauma is so much more common than most people realize. It's not something that just happens to other people.
It touches so many lives.
Yeah.
Often in ways that are really hidden or subtle.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we tend to think of trauma in these dramatic terms, but like we've learned, it can take so many different forms.
Yeah, it can be that childhood adversity we talked about. Or that ongoing stress of, you know, living in a society with so much systemic oppression.
And because trauma can manifest in so many different ways. You know, it's really important to kind of move away from that judgment and assumptions when we're interacting with others.
Absolutely.
You know, somebody who's struggling with anger issues or addiction or even relationship problems. They might be dealing with the long-term consequences of some kind of trauma.
We just don't know what other people have been through.
And so that makes me wonder, like, how can we as individuals cultivate more empathy and understanding, you know, in our interactions, especially when we don't know what that other person might have been through?
I think it starts with shifting our perspective.
Okay.
Instead of jumping to conclusions or offering advice,
Right.
we can approach people with genuine curiosity and a willingness to really listen without judging them.
Remember that phrase, what happened to you,
Right.
instead of what's wrong with you.
Exactly. And I think this applies not only to our personal relationships,
Mm.
but also how we engage with our communities
Right.
and society at large.
Yeah.
Understanding trauma can really inform our approach to social justice issues,
Mm-hmm.
how we design our systems of care,
Right.
and how we advocate for policies that really promote
Right.
healing and well-being.
So it's not just about individual healing. It's about collective healing.
Absolutely.
It's recognizing that that we're all connected.
We are.
And that creating this trauma-informed world benefits everybody.
I love that it really challenges us to think differently.
Right.
Instead of focusing on punishment or blame,
Right.
we can shift our focus to understanding,
Right.
why people might be behaving in harmful ways
Mm-hmm.
and creating systems that support healing and restoration.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
It has.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what's one final thought that you want to leave our listener with?
Mhm.
Something for them to reflect on as they continue to explore this topic.
I think the most important thing to remember is that while trauma can have a huge impact on our lives,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to define us.
Right.
Healing is possible.
Mm.
Resilience is something we can all cultivate.
Yeah.
And there's always hope for a better future.
That's a really powerful message. And for our listener, if you're feeling inspired
Mhm.
to learn more, or if you're seeking support on your own healing journey,
Yeah.
we're going to include some helpful resources in the show notes
Great.
for this episode.
And remember, you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who care, who understand,
Yeah.
and who want to help.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into trauma.
Mhm.
We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit empowering. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep